Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Leonardo, Rogério for organizing, Dimitri for organizing this event in Brazil. I think it's very important to have this kind of debate here, and actually for people to see what other people are doing in the rest of the world, and also for us to get to talk about our case. This session is about strategies for development regarding the exchange rate, and since I have been in this other job in the last 7 years, I really talk mostly about Brazil because it's what I know more, but I will make some comments about the other possible lessons for other countries, and I think the problem of Brazil is actually not only a problem for Brazil. It's actually how you balance these impacts of the exchange rate on inflation and welfare on one side, and on development on the other side. So first of all, I will just, as I usually do, organizing just the ideas in 3 questions. So what happened in the Brazilian exchange rate recently? What were the determinants of that? Why that happened? Why the exchange rate evolved as it did? And what are the main implications for growth, economic distribution, and for economic development at large? Well, first, what happened? Since 2006, which is the current cycle that we are in now, most of the exchange rate fluctuations have been determined by the evolution of commodity prices and international financial conditions. It's when the Brazilian currency became more and more an emerging market currency, a commodity currency, and its dynamics has been mostly influenced by international conditions and commodity prices rather than by domestic conditions. After the 2008 crisis, the Brazilian government responded to the quantitative easing in advanced economies by quantitative tightening in the domestic FX market. After the first impact was absorbed, then Brazil adopted a lot of capital controls in a way to try to prevent too much appreciation. So it's a kind of a way to balance imperfectly the impact of quantitative easing on our exchange rate. More recently, as everybody has been keeping track, the expectation of the end of quantitative easing in the US has resulted in a realignment of asset prices all over the world and produced depreciation in Brazil. Despite that, there's a recurring trend in Brazil. Because of our system of inflation targeting, and because the inflation target here is the impact of interest rates on aggregate demand is very small, there's a recurring trend for the Brazilian real to appreciate in the absence of shocks, because the logic of macroeconomic policy actually pushes the Brazilian exchange rate down to help contain inflation. To illustrate that, this is the real exchange rate of Brazil since 1993. And I divide that in 3 main periods. First, you have the period of fixed exchange rates, the real plan, from 1993, actually started earlier, to 1998. Fixed rate, and then an appreciation exchange rate anchor. Then you have the periods of very high volatility, where Brazil was subject to speculative attacks, the first one after the Argentine crisis, the first one after our own crisis in 1999, then the Argentine crisis, then the election of 2002, and then a correction. By the end of 2005, the real exchange rate was back to where it was after we started with a floating exchange rate regime. And then it starts the current cycle, the one which we are now, which is a cycle where the Brazilian exchange rate is mostly fluctuating according to the volatility of international financial conditions and commodity prices. There was a boom in commodity prices until 2008, crisis, another boom in commodity prices until mid-2011, and then depreciation. And this is the end of QE. What can we say in terms of the main determinants of that? This is the recent cycle, so those are the 3 cycles. Now focusing on the recent cycle, the cycle from 2006 until now. You had, up until the crisis, this is the blue line is the Brazilian commodity price index, the red line is the Brazilian exchange rate against the US dollar. This is our own definition of the exchange rate, okay? This is for foreigners, this is the domestic price of foreign currency. So when it goes up, it means that your currency has depreciated. It's the reverse of what you do in advanced economies. So until, let's say, the end of 2009, the fluctuation of the exchange rate was mostly associated with fluctuations in commodity prices. Then you had a boom, another boom after QE and China accelerated in 2009 and 10. You had another boom in commodity prices. But the exchange rate in Brazil did not appreciate that much. This is where when the Brazilian government relied heavily on capital controls, capital regulation, in the foreign exchange market, in financing, prudential regulation. And it was a kind of successful in terms of not letting the exchange rate appreciate too much. There was a boom in commodity prices, but the exchange rate actually stayed flat. And it started to depreciate, as was pointed earlier, by, I think, by Kevin and by Luiz Fernando, when the Brazilian government actually started to try to control derivative operations. That's when you have this first spike here and here. And now this is the end of quantitative easing. And after, in the beginning of 2013, because of the change in international financial conditions, the government reversed most of its controls. Now, how did we fare? This is hard to see in the back, but what I'm going to do now is compare the evolution of the Brazilian nominal exchange rate against the US dollar with other currencies. Because if you take only the recent period, you tend to think that the Brazilian currency has depreciated too much. But if you take the whole period, as I said, the period that started in 2006, which is when Brazil entered in the commodity cycle, and see how did we fare so far. So first let's first start to compare Brazil with other commodity exporting economies. The red line is Brazil, the blue line is Australia, and the brown line is South Africa. As you can see, the Brazilian economy, the Brazilian real pretty much fluctuated together with the Australian dollar until the end of 2011. After that, the Australian dollar actually depreciated less than the Brazilian real, because we resorted more to capital controls, then we pushed the exchange rate up. And the South African economy actually, it tends to fluctuate together with the other currencies, but at a higher level, and because of, I believe, domestic issues in the South African economy, has been hurt more by the current change in international financial perspectives. Next, Brazil with other large emerging economies, Brazil, India, and Mexico. Again, Brazil is the red line, Mexico is the blue line, India is the, yellow line. Right now the Brazilian rate is in nominal terms, at the same level as it were in 2005. The Mexican economy actually depreciated after 2008 crisis and did not come back to the same level, so it's a gain in competitiveness. And India, it depreciated a little bit, and now it's actually being hurt more by the change in international financial conditions because of the fiscal situation in India and the current account situation. But again, when you compare to large economies, roughly the same size in terms of GDP of Brazil, actually there's more appreciation than in other countries. Appreciation, yeah, it's turned around. Now, Brazil and the main reserve currencies. Again, this is the red line, Brazil an appreciation, and now this depreciation. This yellow line here is the British pound, which is, you can see how the UK is developing its way out of the current situation. Actually, there's a structural change in the dollar-pound rate. And Japan and the Eurozone, actually, a small appreciation against the US dollar. Japan is the blue line, the Eurozone is this line here, which I can no longer see what color that is. Okay. Brazil and Asia. Red line Brazil, again, back to 2005, same nominal exchange rate. The Chinese are doing what they do. They are devaluing gradually. They're actually appreciating gradually, so the exchange rate, the amount of Chinese currency per unit of US dollar is gradually going down. And South Korea, similar to what happened with Mexico, there was a huge depreciation, then a correction, but still stabilized at a higher level, at a 10% level. So at the end of the day, what we have, some countries took the opportunity of the crisis actually to correct the exchange rate, and they stabilize after the initial impact. They stabilize at a higher level than before the crisis. Some other countries, as China, they have their long-term agenda. They are appreciating gradually against the US dollar. And Brazil actually depreciated, now is back to the same level of the nominal exchange rate of 2005. Why that? Why Brazil did not stabilize this exchange rate at a higher level? Because in Brazil, the exchange rate is usually the main transmission mechanism of monetary policy to inflation. In Brazil, though, when you increase interest rates, you don't have a very large wealth effect because you have indexed public bonds. The stock market actually does not respond that much to the interest rate, so you don't have large wealth effects. The credit channel in Brazil is actually improving. It's much stronger now than it was 10 years ago, but it's still small. Housing credit in Brazil is 5–6% of GDP. So when you hike interest rates, you don't get a negative, very strong negative effect on credit markets. You have a negative effect, but it's not that strong as it is, for instance, in advanced economies. So the bulk of the adjustment comes through the exchange rate. Because of this, since the beginning of inflation targeting, actually the real exchange rate appreciated in almost all years in which the target was met. So it has been, even though there's no formal targeting of the exchange rate, it has been the main transmission mechanism. The government obviously does not target the exchange rate, but it tries to reduce its volatility. But at the end of the day, the dynamics of the exchange rate ends up impacting on the dynamics of inflation, and through this, it affects the whole macroeconomic policy, monetary and fiscal. In theory, inflation target is compatible with exchange rate smoothing. You can have both. But since we rely so much on the exchange rate channel, that's why the Brazilian currency has a recurring trend to appreciate. Now, this is the Brazilian inflation for those that are not familiar with our economy. In the period of depreciation, you have an acceleration of inflation, went up to almost 12.5% in 2002. Then depreciation, appreciation of the Brazilian real, and fast reduction in inflation. Now is the current period where inflation is stuck at 6%, and those 2 points there are the market expectations that tend to be more pessimistic. The government actually expects inflation to be below 6 this year and around 5.5 next year. And what's behind that story? This is the inflation rate of tradable goods, this is the orange line, and non-tradable goods, the blue line. When we had the sharp depreciation of the real, the tradable inflation went up very high to 20% per year. And then, since then, it has remained below the inflation in the tradable goods. So it's a two-velocity inflation situation. The tradable inflation is actually low when compared to non-tradable inflation. And this creates some distortions in the economy. Now, I don't dare for you to read this, but I put this because this presentation will be available to everybody after the event. What I want to show this is 14 years of inflation targeting. What I try to do here is this. This is the target that was set by the government. This is the interval of tolerance and the effective inflation rate. And what I want to show here is whenever this blue lines is when the target was met. It was met in the first year of inflation target, but that does not count because the target was set in mid-year, so there was only 6 months to go, so we already knew what inflation would be. Okay? Then it was met in 2000, 4 years it was not met, and then it has been met since 2005. What I want to stress here is that if you exclude 1999, because it was the first time, and you consider all the years when inflation target was met, in all years when inflation target was met, there was an appreciation of the real exchange rate, except last year. So, this is not an opinion, this is a fact. And every year when the inflation target was met, in the last 13 years, there was an appreciation of the real exchange rate. Only last year, there was a depreciation of the real exchange rate, 12%, and the inflation target was met. So we are now living the brave new world, where because of international conditions, because of the change in commodity prices, monetary policy in Brazil cannot count on continuous appreciation of the real exchange rate to control inflation. And that's why inflation has also stabilized at a higher level. It's a very simple result. Now, is this a success? Is this a failure? I believe it is a mixed result, because even with all this, Brazil took the opportunity of this good international scenario in past years to do some changes in its own economy. And what we have in Brazil, being this an economist audience, what I try to portray as two non-linearities and one asymmetry. And don't be afraid about the terms. What I mean about two non-linearities is that there's a relationship, a long-run relationship, between the level of the exchange rate and the growth rate of Brazil. The level at which the relative price stabilizes impacts on economic growth. There is also a long-run relationship between the level of the exchange rate and inflation in Brazil. The level at which the exchange rate stabilizes also determines long-run inflation. That's one of the determinants of long-run inflation. And with these two stylized facts, what happens is that if you target inflation, you end up, even if you're not doing that directly, you end up limiting the fluctuation of the exchange rate. Inflation target implicitly leads you to put an informal, a non-explicit bound on the fluctuation of the exchange rate. How are these? And this creates what I call one asymmetric response of monetary policy. When you have a depreciation, the government usually responds to that by raising the interest rate to defend its currency, and it does not sell its reserves. It sells a little bit of reserves, it lends its reserve, as the central bank is doing now, but it relies more on the interest rate than on FX operations to defend the currency. And when you have appreciation, you reduce interest rate, but since you cannot reduce interest rate very much because you have an inflation targeting, you actually rely more on buying international reserves. So you have an asymmetric response to the change in the exchange rate. This is the relationship between growth and exchange rate. Here's the exchange rate. Here's the economic growth. What you have in Brazil is that whenever the exchange rate is either the currency is too appreciated or too depreciated, the economic growth is slow. When the exchange rate is too much depreciated, there's a lot of inflation, the government steps on the brake to decelerate growth. When the exchange rate is too appreciated, you have current account problems, the government also steps on the brake to decelerate growth. And when the exchange rate is actually in mid-level, growth tends to be at the maximum level. This is an empirical relationship. When you run the regressions, you find that in Brazil. For inflation, you have something strange like this. When the exchange rate is very high, inflation tends to stabilize at a very high level. When the exchange rate is very low, the currency is appreciated, inflation tends to stabilize at a low level. For intermediary levels of the exchange rate, there's actually no clear relationship. It can go up or down. So when you put these two things together, you have here the exchange rate, inflation, and growth. When I target inflation, when I say the maximum inflation will be this, the minimum inflation will be this, I end up implicitly setting a limit to the real exchange rate, which, in its turn, puts a limit on the fluctuation of GDP growth. That's why, even with all these problems that we have been mentioned, high interest rate, recurring trend to appreciate, it has been working in Brazil. Brazil does not target the real exchange rate, but since inflation depends on the real exchange rate, inflation target itself ends up limiting the fluctuation of the real exchange rate. And in doing so, it also stabilizes growth in this interval. So that creates some macroeconomic stability. That's pretty much the story of the last 10 to 12 years. Now, what about the real interest rate? On the good side, this asymmetric response, well, on the bad side, the asymmetric response of monetary policy tends to create a recurring trend to appreciate the Brazilian real. Despite that, this asymmetric monetary policy was also able to reduce the Brazilian real interest rate in recent years. Despite that, our real interest rate is still very high by any international standard. And the recent change in the Brazilian terms of trade indicates that we can no longer rely on permanent real exchange rate appreciation to control inflation. To illustrate that, this is the Brazilian real interest rate, expected real interest rate. The beginning of inflation target, it fluctuated between 12 to 22%, very high and very volatile. Then it's the beginning of the Lula administration, it fluctuated between 8 and 14%. When we had the currency, the international crisis, actually Brazil, the level reduced to 4 to 10, 2 to 8, and now it's something around 2%, 3%. So even though this very problematic exchange rate performance in terms of development, this has allowed a big change in the Brazilian real interest rates. If you compare in terms of 14 years, it came down from something between 12 to 22 to something between 2 and 4 now. So is it a failure? Is it a success? It actually is a mixed result. Depends on how you want to interpret, it is a mixed result. This is the terms of trade. This is a very sharp increase, especially after the crisis when there was quantitative easing and the acceleration of growth in China. Now a small reduction, but it's still the terms of trade are very high by any historical standard. What are the main implications? Well, first, to reduce financial fragility, the government increased its foreign reserves in a context of high real interest rates. The government also has been using financial incentives to compensate the negative impact of appreciation. So try to compensate the exchange rate through financial incentives, lower interest rates from state banks. These two actions, in a context of very high real interest rates, increase gross debt, gross public debt, and increase the financial cost of public debt. So it ends up affecting and limiting fiscal policy in the medium run. And the appreciation of the exchange rate created a two-velocity economy, where the tradable sector is growing very slowly, and the non-tradable sector is growing fast. So these are the main implications. This is the figure about this is the gross public debt of Brazil, this is the net public debt of Brazil, and you have an opening gap, especially recently, because public debt, the gross debt is growing fast because of the costs of foreign reserves and the loans to state banks, but the net debt is going down. The difference between these two series are the assets that the government bought, issuing more debt than it needed to cover its deficits. And how that is distributed, this is the difference between gross and net public debt, and I divide this in three main assets. You have foreign reserves, you have the FAT fund, which is a government fund that finances unemployment insurance, and you have the loans to financial institutions, mostly to BNDES. It's 9% of GDP now. Now, this has worked very well. This is the Brazilian form of quantitative easing to fight the crisis, but it has a high financial cost. So at some point, as the US is discussing how to gradually end up its quantitative easing, Brazil is also discussing how to gradually end up this form of quantitative easing. And this will be done gradually, and as this progresses, it will gradually reduce the cost of public debt. The other problem is the competitiveness. This is the Brazilian unit labor cost. This is the in foreign currency. So this amount of US dollars that is paid by workers per unit of output. Since 1989. They have two periods of increasing unit labor costs. This is the real plan when you have the appreciation, and then you have the depreciation of the Brazilian, Argentine, and the election of 2002, and then the appreciation. This is the current depreciation. It reduced the unit labor cost, but it's still very high by historical standards. So to regain competitiveness, this has to adjust. The question is how it will adjust. And to conclude, there are three theoretical ways to adjust this. And the policy you choose depends on which risks you're going to take. You want it to take, and who's going to bear those risks. The first is internal devaluation, let's say the European way. Don't touch the exchange rate. Slow down your economy. Increase unemployment so that wages grow slower, and you reduce the unit labor cost through the labor market. High social costs, whether you can bear that or not, is something to be seen. External devaluation, it seems something that a lot of people here defend. You increase the exchange rate substantially, then you reduce the real wage, and you adjust it through the exchange rate. This is how this is usually done in Latin America. The exchange rate is actually faster than the labor market. It has a social cost and imposes a reduction of the real wage immediately in exchange for what? For faster productivity growth in the long run. But in the long run, everybody knows. And this is my main diversion with these two guys here. And you have the growth way. Well, try to increase productivity, accelerate growth, increase investment, do some reforms in tax reform, financial reform, so that you increase productivity. So you end up reduce your unit labor cost in a progressive way, with higher productivity, and you try to preserve real wages at most that you can. So this immediately is a political choice. What happens? Usually a combination of the three. What's happening in Brazil right now is you have some external devaluation, some slowdown in the labor market, and the government is trying to increase labor productivity. What has been the Brazilian response? And this is for the press in the back. This is the right response. The Brazilian government chose the growth alternative and has been trying to increase labor productivity through a series of actions. It has increasing investment. It has been increasing financial incentives for private investment. It has been increasing financial incentives for innovation, higher investment in education, and some institutional reforms. What's the problem with this strategy? It takes some time for it to work, and maybe not fast enough to adjust the unit labor costs in the speed that the balance of payment needs. But this is a strategy that any government that is worried about the welfare of its people must try to pursue. I'll jump that because I have no time. Esther already talked about that. What are the results so far? Economic growth and investment are accelerating, but the productivity gains tend to materialize slowly. Well, in the first half of this year, 500 people entered the universities with government loans. It will take 4 or 5 years for these people to get out of the universities, to get their degree. So this will increase productivity in Brazil, 4 or 5 years ahead. Investment in infrastructure is also recovering, but everybody knows. It's always everyday news in the paper. What's the next auction of the government? Did it work or not? It's improving gradually, but it will take time to improve productivity. The political cycle blocks any reform. There will be no major reform this year, next year, because of the elections. This happens in any democracy, by the way. It's not a Brazilian thing. And the pace of recovery investment and the pace of reforms will, at the end of the day, determine how much of the adjustment will be done through productivity, through the real wage, or through the exchange rate. What a government in a democracy is trying to do is to pursue the adjustment that is less costly for the majority of its population. Thank you.
Quanto mais alto que eu, ele, né? Bom, I will talk, in English, a different point than my friend Nelson, because his main question is about how to devalue or how to reach a more competitive exchange rate or lower unit labor cost. My focus is on how to manage a competitive exchange rate. So, yeah. This is, sorry for the Spanish. This is in 2002, 2003, South American countries reached the more depreciated real exchange rates as from the reincorporation to the international financial markets in the late 80s, early 90s. From then on, in most of these countries, the real exchange rate followed a persistent appreciation trend that took the rates to levels similar to the more appreciated of the 90s. So Brazil is not a special case. This has happened in all Latin America, particularly in South America. In Argentina, this is the depreciated real exchange rate attained in 2003 when the exchange rate market and inflation were stabilized and the economy started to recover at a fast pace. Lasted for a few more years than its neighbors, but an appreciation trend was also experienced as from 2008 and accelerated as from 2010. So also in Argentina, the recent level of the real exchange rate is similar to the convertibility period. Consequently, the international competitiveness of the economies has been seriously impaired. The unit labor cost in constant dollars have recently reached values similar to the highest of the 90s. Export concentrated in commodities, manufacturing industry lost weight in output and employment, and the positive current account results that allow the substantial reduction of the foreign debt and the accumulation of reserves turned into growing deficits. Many economists, including myself, have investigated the role of the real exchange rate in the development process. I believe that a consensus has been reached, at least between developing economists, on the positive role played by competitive real exchange rates. Regrettably, the Latin American experiences provides more evidence about the negative effects of appreciated real exchange rate than support to the positive effects of depreciated rates on development. I do not intend to go again on this discussion here. Instead, I shall focus on the policies needed to preserve a competitive real exchange rate, say CRER. I take as a starting point that some emerging market country adopts a competitive real exchange rate and devote the presentation to discuss the appropriate measures to achieve that goal. The presentation can be read or heard as what the countries could have done starting from the depreciating exchange rate that we all reached in 2002, 2003. First point is about the stability and sustainability of the competitive real exchange rate target. In order to discuss the implementation of a real exchange rate target, we think that other attributes need to be added to the real exchange rate goal besides its competitiveness. The first attribute we add is the stability of the competitive real exchange rate. Adopting a real exchange rate target seeks to orient the allocation of real and financial resources in the economy. The formation of agents' expectation of future real exchange rates is crucial to that end. The agents must not only perceive that the current exchange rate is competitive, but they should also believe that competitiveness will last in the future. In other words, agents must be convinced that the government has the tools and the will to prevent the real exchange rate from appreciating as much as to significantly reduce the profitability of the financial real investment and employment decisions that economic policy aims to preserve, that the economic policy decision assuming line of the current relative prices. The government's announcement that economic policy aims to preserve the competitive real exchange rate certainly helps that expectations are geared in that direction. But the main source of learning for the formation of expectations is the agent's experience, the observation of the actual behavior of the real exchange rate, and the repeated success of the measures taken by the government to keep the real exchange rate in the competitive range. Consequently, the goal considered in this presentation is a competitive real exchange rate stable in the sense defined, just defined. Stable expectations, is expectation of a stable real exchange rate in the long term. Sustainability is the second qualification, which we think needs to be added to the definition of the real exchange rate target. A sustainable real exchange rate target means that its implementation should not generate trends that end up making it unfeasible. The most obvious example of these trends is inflation. If the measures required to implement a square target induce the persistent acceleration of inflation or make it difficult the implementation of measures to keep it under control, the goal must necessarily be abandoned at some point. Inflation is not the only example. The evolution of other variables may also affect the sustainability of the target. For example, if the implemented policy induces an explosive trend in the quasi-fiscal deficit of the central bank or in the fiscal deficit, the goal will become unfeasible at some point and the policy should be abandoned. With the addition of the sustainability attribute, the target that has to be discussed in this paper, in this presentation, is a SCRER, a sustainable, stable, competitive real exchange rate. In what follows, we analyze the threat to sustainability posed by an inflationary trend, and then the sustainability problem related to the sterilization policy I discuss afterwards. So the control of aggregate demand and inflation. The transmission channels of a competitive real exchange rate imply the rapid growth in private demand in the markets for locally produced tradable goods, in the labor market, and in the market for investment goods. The combined effects result in a rapid growth in private demand in all markets, tradable and non-tradables. This induces the acceleration of growth, but can also establish a sui generis inflationary pressure generated by the rapid growth in aggregate demand induced by the stable and sustainable competitive real exchange rate. So the adoption of a square target makes the policy context different from others in one crucial aspect. Exchange rate policy is a permanent driver of demand growth, which can also give rise to inflationary pressure. And it is unlikely that this stimulus can be regulated by fine-tuning the exchange rate policy. Consequently, the monetary and fiscal policy required to accompany the adoption of a stable and sustainable real exchange rate target must also have special features. The permanent expansionary stimulus that is part and parcel of the competitive real exchange rate target heighten the importance of the restraining role to be normally played by fiscal and monetary policies. As can be seen, the sustainability criterion of the real exchange rate target broadens the range of policies that are involved in its implementation. The sustainability of the real exchange rate target imposes requirements and restrictions on fiscal and monetary policy. The exchange rate policy needs to be part of a wider framework that includes fiscal and monetary policy consistent with it. For this reason, the adoption of a competitive real exchange rate target needs to be understood as a component of a macroeconomic policy regime capable of pursuing multiple conflicting objectives in a consistent way. This square regime pursues growth, employment, activity level, and inflation objectives simultaneously. The square is an intermediate target of this regime, as a given interest rate might be for monetary policy or a given primary surplus for fiscal policy. Once a determined trend for the real exchange rate is adopted, exchange rate policy focuses exclusively on both granting short-term volatility of the nominal exchange rate and preserving the long-term stability of the real exchange rate. Thus, in normal times, the nominal exchange rate cannot be oriented towards any other macroeconomic objective such as inflation or inflation expectations. The control of aggregate demand, inflation, and inflation expectation rest on monetary and fiscal policy, and also on other policies not discussed here, such as wage and incomes policy. In this regime, the coordination of macroeconomic policy is essential. In the first place, the intermediate targets of fiscal and monetary policy and their design should be consistent with the stability of the real exchange rate trend target. For instance, it is difficult to preserve the stability of the real exchange rate trend in a context of accelerating inflation. This is the problem that the Argentine authorities could not resolve as from 2007 and finally led to a significant real exchange rate appreciation. The management of policies in the square regime is not easy. On the one hand, there is a tension between the preservation of the square target and the aggregate demand and inflation control. On the other hand, the breaking role that monetary and fiscal policy should normally play in this context demand a sophisticated political leadership. Sophisticated, I mean, you have to know enough about economy. But both observations stress the importance of macroeconomic policy coordination at the highest level of the economic policy administration. Exchange rate policy. Managed floating is defined as a regime under which the authorities are not committed to defend any particular rate, but nevertheless intervene in the foreign exchange market at their discretion. It seems to be the best exchange rate arrangement to implement a credit policy in present times. The managed floating regime shows its best virtues when the central bank holds a sizable amount of reserves. The availability of a significant amount of foreign reserves under any exchange rate regime reduces the risks of default of public and private debts due to insufficient international liquidity in the occurrence, for example, of a sudden stop of capital inflows. But the combination of abundant reserves and managed floating has other beneficial effects. Faced with a negative external shock, exchange rate flexibility leads to exchange rate depreciation, and this contributes to the adjustment of the economy to the new external condition. In this case, the availability of reserves allows the intervention to control the devaluation, avoiding overshooting and bubbles, and limiting the negative balance sheet effects on banks and companies. On the other hand, the exhibition of large reserves gives greater strength to the central bank's ability to guide foreign exchange market, and thus large-scale selling intervention may not be required. Central bank intervention in the exchange market are intended to maintain a square trend. Once the rare target has been defined, the nominal exchange rate should follow a stochastic path around a PPP trend. The advantages of the short-run exchange rate floating should be preserved. In that regards, the central bank intervention in the foreign exchange market have to achieve two conflicting targets. They have to prevent the formation of rate appreciation expectation and to allow the nominal exchange rate to float in order to de-incentive one-way bets and short-term capital flows. Flexibility should also be preserved. It seems advisable to avoid rules, announcements, and commitments and deliver signals in implicit ways throughout the central bank interventions in the foreign exchange market. Nevertheless, in order to contribute to the expectation formation, it seems important that the central bank and the government make clear the important role given by the competitive exchange rate within the development strategy, even if it does not imply any formal commitment. The foreign exchange market is an asset market. Buying and selling decisions are to a great extent based on expectations. Expectations about the future exchange rate should be the main target of the central bank interventions. For this reason, the central bank market intervention should be bold in order to clearly show to the market participant the willingness and strength of the monetary authority. I didn't have a good example of a bold intervention until the Swiss central bank fixed a cap on the real exchange rate of Switzerland. Yeah? So this is what I call a bold intervention. And you convince the market. Monetary policy. To discuss the monetary policy in a sustainable, stable, competitive real exchange rate regime, we need to first show that the adoption of the real exchange target leaves enough monetary autonomy to conduct an active monetary policy. Sorry, I will conflict with our Luiz Fernando. Monetary autonomy. A common objection to central bank intervention in the foreign exchange markets is that they would entail a loss of monetary autonomy. This criticism is based on the well-known trilemma of economies open to capital movements. The trilemma asserts that the central bank cannot simultaneously control the nominal exchange rate and the interest rate in a context of free capital movements. The trilemma is false in some circumstances, not in all, and is thus false as a general characterization of open economies. A condition for the simultaneous control of the nominal exchange rate and monetary autonomy is the existence of an excess supply of foreign exchange at the nominal exchange rate and interest rate targeted by the central bank. In these circumstances, the monetary authority can set the nominal exchange rate by purchasing the excess supply in the foreign exchange market and can control the interest rate by sterilizing the monetary effects of this intervention, which is thus by issuing treasury or central banks bonds in the money market. The central bank has two instruments for achieving its two goals: intervention in the foreign exchange market to set the nominal exchange rate, and intervention in the money markets to determine the interest rate. In the more general case, there is a large quantity of domestic assets, including land and real estate, which are in excess demand as a counterpart to the excess supply of external assets. The monetary autonomy exercised through the sterilization policy need to be understood as the capacity of the monetary authority to control the instrument rates of its monetary policy. The variables targeted by the sterilization policy ought to be the interest rates of the assets which the central bank operates, and not an underlying quantitative variables, base money or other monetary variables. The next part of my presentation focuses on the sterilization, on the sustainability of sterilization policy. The main point here is that there is a maximum interest rate by monetary policy that allows the sustainability of the sterilization policy in the long run, in the short and in the long run. So there is a maximum exchange rate that can be instrumented by the central bank sustainably. If this policy is not sustainable, it doesn't mean that the sterilization policy becomes unfeasible in the short run, but that there is a trend to a continuous losing of monetary autonomy. So I will now go in depth in the sterilization policy. Everybody can read it. I published a couple of papers in the CEPAL review in 2007 and 2008. Yeah, I published some papers in 77, yeah. But not about sterilization policy. At that time, sterilization policy in our country was so important, no? So we have to we have to try other stabilization policy than monetary, that alone at least. So in I will go right to the conclusions. Because there is a guy here telling me, say 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes. So it's intolerable. So it's well, like in every seminar, we never go in depth to the technical issues. So we talk for the press. Well, the conclusion we arrive is that there is, I say, a maximum interest rate that can be sustainable, applied in order to control aggregate demand and inflation in a sustainable, competitive real exchange rate regime. So, in one of the studies, I present a number of numerical exercises involving different inflation and growth scenarios and using plausibly that data and parameters. The results suggest that the sterilization policy are sustainable and that a considerable degree of permanent monetary autonomy exists in contexts that are by no means uncommon in many developing economies. The conclusions must be that the exchange rate policy in a square regime does not usually inhibit the exercise of monetary policy. The orthodox criticism is thus not valid, even with freedom of capital movements on the obvious assumption that domestic and external assets are not perfect substitutes. This regime is not incompatible with a considerable degree of monetary autonomy. The above conclusion does not imply, because they say there, however, that in this regime, or more generally, in any context in which the central bank intervenes in the foreign exchange market to avoid the appreciation of the real exchange rate, the control of aggregate demand and inflation pressures can exclusively rest on monetary policy. The sustainability conditions put an upper limit to the policy interest rate. This constraint could combine with a low interest rate elasticity of the aggregate demand that for instance, Nelson showed us that this is the case of Brazil. The limit the effects of, with a low rate interest rate elasticity demand that generates circumstances in which the regulatory capacity of monetary policy becomes greatly impaired. The level of the interest rate capable of influencing the aggregate demand dynamics could be higher than the maximum sustainable interest rate. I think this is the case of Brazil, obviously. No? A low elasticity of aggregate demand is observable even in economies with a high degree of financial intermediation. It seems highly probable that many developing economies share this feature. Our conclusion in that regard is that in a square regime, active monetary policy can and should be practiced because all available instruments should be used to control the pace of aggregate demand and inflation pressure. But the responsibility could not rest primarily or exclusively on monetary policy. This observation highlights the crucial role that fiscal policy has to play in a square regime, which is also bad news for the management of monetary policy, no? of this kind of economic policy. So the conclusions are, as a way of synthesizing what I presented, I present here the guidelines of a square macroeconomic policy regime. The first subset of guidelines, 1 to 4, comprises a managed floating exchange rate a managed floating exchange rate regime combining exchange rate flexibility with discretionary intervention by the central bank in the in the foreign exchange market, a competitive level trend in the real exchange rate, avoiding strong appreciation in the short run, a surplus trend in the current account of the balance of payment, and moderate current account deficit in the short run, and fourth, the accumulation of sizable international reserves. Relative high rate of growth and employment are fostered by the competitive trend of the real exchange rate. The current account surplus trend plus the accumulation of reserves warrant the sustainability of the growth process by helping to avoid external crises and cushioning negative real and financial external shocks. The policies involving the real exchange rate, external accounts, and the reserve management should be accompanied by consistent fiscal and monetary policies focused on the control of aggregate demand and inflation. An important point in that regard is that in a context of managed floating exchange rate, competitive real exchange rate and surplus trade in the current account generally exists a considerable degree of monetary autonomy that allows the implementation of active monetary policy. So with regard to monetary policy, the suggested guideline is the fifth, an active monetary policy facilitated by the sterilization of the intervention in the foreign exchange market and the inexistence of fiscal dominance. As we already commented, coordination between the three macroeconomic policies, fiscal, exchange rate, and monetary, is essential in this regime. In particular, monetary policy should be implemented in coordination with short-run fiscal policy. Depending on the pressures in the foreign exchange market, capital controls might be necessary to simultaneously attain the preservation of a competitive real exchange rate and the preservation of monetary autonomy. As in any macroeconomic policy regime, short-run fiscal policy can be either expansionary or contractionary. Also, we point out before that in this regime, monetary and fiscal policy should normally play a breaking role on the aggregate demand dynamics. Our last guideline refers to the orientation of the fiscal accounts. In an equilibrium trend in the fiscal accounts and moderate fiscal deficit in the short run. The orientation focuses on allowing counter-cyclical policy to short run, aggregate demand and inflation control in the booming phases, and expansionary stimuli in the recessionary phases, and on avoiding the accumulation of important public debts. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the Minsk Institute, to the Ford Foundation, and to Minds for this inviting me. So my theme will be the policy revealed preference for immediate consumption. But first a comment on Roberto. I know that we are going to discuss later, but you made a wonderful discussion about exchange rate policy. But this is not very orthodox, my dear Roberto. There is no exchange rate policy. In the books, in the textbooks, there is just interest policy and fiscal policy. This is not very orthodox. but it's essential. It's extremely important for, and also what Nelson presented, for developing countries, for countries that borrow in foreign money. An exchange rate policy is absolutely fundamental. And this is what we should take in mind. And there was, Roberto gives us a lot of ideas he has been developing for long on how to do this. Okay, how I do this here now. Well, I will begin with the Fed announcement in May that would pay off the quantitative easing. And the currencies depreciated strongly in developing countries against the dollar. Okay, we all saw this happening. But some currencies depreciated more than others. The depreciation ended in September when Ben Bernanke postponed the tailing off of the issuing of the money by Fed. In Brazil, it ended before, a little before, when the central bank intervened strongly and said, no, you are going to intervene the market strongly till the end of the year. And at that moment, the things, and when came the Bernanke new announcement, things changed. My question is, and why some currencies depreciated more than others? Why specifically Brazil's real, South Africa's rand, India's rupee, Indonesia's rupiah, and Turkey's lira depreciate more than the others. That's, I'd say, this is the question that I put to myself to discuss with you today, the questions of exchange rate, etc. I suppose, look, to all countries, the Bernanke information, all the same, but I suppose that the exchange rate we're getting overvalued more than the others, that their current accounts were turning very high, current account deficits, the current account deficit, lacking a deficit word there, and that the foreign debt ratios were beginning to worry foreign creditors. Very simple, old things. Overvaluation of the exchange rate, current account deficit, foreign debt. And because, given these facts, financial markets mounted a mild speculative attack on them. Well, but why? Why these countries? Today I'm not interested in demonstrating that really these countries have a current account more appreciated, no, an exchange rate more appreciated, a current account deficit bigger, and foreign debt ratios higher than the others. This would be a nice exercise, but I am not going to do this. I just note that in early August, Morgan Stanley called Brazil, India, South Africa, and Turkey, and Indonesia the 5 fragile countries. And it was against the 5 fragile countries that the attack was mounted. Then my question is, why, by hell, why should we always be fragile? Why don't we learn that there is no sense in becoming fragile? Why we get indebted? Really, do you need to get indebted? For many years, I believed so. My idea was that, I never wrote this, but it was implicit, was that, and this was common to all my friends, Keynesians, all my friends, structuralists, that the good strategy for a country would be to have the more indebted possible, since not getting into a financial crisis, to a currency crisis. So be here with the debt, not here. That's this. Today, I think that this is fully wrong. Fully wrong. I would say that developing countries that have a Dutch disease are supposed to have a current account surplus, not a deficit. Argentina, this is a discussion with you, Roberto. Argentina is not supposed to have a moderate current account deficit. It's supposed to have a moderate current account surplus, in my view. A few months, 3 years ago, more or less, when things were beginning to become bad in Argentina, but were not yet, a journalist, international journalist, but was at that moment in Buenos Aires, called me, asking me what I had to say about the Argentinian situation. And I said, look, the only thing is that they should not get in current account deficit. Because in the moment that they get in current account deficit, this means that they also are getting in overvalued currency, and in this moment, they will be in trouble. They have been growing at 8% a year for several years because they have a current account surplus. Because a current account surplus is consistent with a competitive exchange rate, the exchange rate that you should have to grow. The same is fair to Brazil, for sure. The table is not. So, what I'm saying that for developing countries, turning financially fragile is not a necessary risk if they want to grow. It's not a fate, because the idea is a fate. No, it's not a fate. You don't need it. But a major economic policy error. And the economic policy error that's not well discussed in the literature. A major economic error, why? Essentially because it implies some ignorances. We ignore some things. First, that there is in developing countries a tendency to the chronic and cyclical overvaluation of the exchange rate. If you look to the data that Nelson presented, you can see these cycles in the case of Brazil. But you can see the other, he showed several other currencies, and you can see also there. You go, a country that does not manage, that does not have an effective exchange rate policy, goes from sudden stop to sudden stop, from financial crisis to financial crisis. When there is the financial crisis, it's a sharp depreciation, and then it begins appreciation, appreciation, appreciation. Cause why? Cause why? No? For several reasons, but and a first reason, first is because you have the Dutch disease, but is the third here. But second, that when you decide to grow with a current account deficit, this means that you have decided to grow with an overvalued currency. And this makes no sense. I will give you, makes no sense to try to grow with overvalued currency. Third, that ignore that the Dutch disease means that you have an overvalued currency. And that, so you have to neutralize this Dutch disease. This is ignored. Forget about the Dutch disease. And fourth, that using the exchange rate as an anchor, Nelson spoke very well about this and showed very clearly how you do that, how the central bank does that in Brazil. But it's not only here. Means to have, again, an overvalued currency. In other words, so what I'm saying is that in this process, in this cycle, the exchange rate depreciates and then gets overvalued because you don't neutralize the Dutch disease, then it goes down for that reason. Second, but the Dutch disease goes just after to the point of the current equilibrium. Then down below the current equilibrium, to current account deficits, is because you are willing to grow with foreign savings, because you are using the exchange rate as an anchor against inflation. Right? These are the essential causes. There are others. And for sure, when you have an increase in the prices of our commodities, this means that the Dutch disease turned more, increase the severity of the Dutch disease, and for sure, there is an appreciation. Well, so you have to know this to have the policy that Roberto is asking. You have to know this and to avoid the things. But why this is so important? Why the exchange rate is so important? First, I think that the fundamental reason is because it disconnects competent business enterprise from demand, and so reduce investment opportunities and the investment themselves. Where is Esther? Where is here yet? Oh, Esther is left. But after in the lunch, I was talking with Esther and saying, look, Esther, I liked very much your presentation. But there was one line, and you said that the investment of the private sector is endogenous. That's all. Let's forget about it. No? Makes no sense for me, this. Absolutely no sense. A good economic policy is supposed to create good investment opportunities for businessmen and to reduce the gains of the financial and rentier sector. So you have to have a policy for this. But when you have an exchange rate that is overvalued, you are disconnecting all these enterprises from their markets. And look, I have here a very important Keynesian economist, to begin with, my friend Jan. Jan is there, outstanding Keynesian economist. Well, what Keynes did in the first chapter of the general theory was to say, look, the CEDES law does not work. You have to think there is a problem of insufficiency of demand, and you have to face this. Well, in developing countries, this is not enough, because there is a second problem. There is insufficiency of access to demand. And only, why? Because this tendency of the overvaluation of the exchange rate. So you have to also have a policy to not only to keep demand sufficient, but to keep access to demand sufficient. Look, for instance, what happened in Brazil recently. You know that President Lula ended his administration in a glorious way. Why? Because the rate of growth increased, it doubled. Income get better distributed. Inflation was under control. And he was not only locally, but also internationally very well. And then came President Dilma. And Dilma said, well, I will continue the same policy that Mr. Lula. There was only one problem. This was impossible. Why it was impossible? Because Lula administration was so successful, for sure, because he had a courageous policy of increasing the minimum wage and more generally of distributing. And this was very important. He profited from the opportunity of the rise in the exports of our commodities to do that. Wonderful. But he was also very lucky because there was this big rise in the price of commodities. And second, because he appreciated, during his administration, the appreciation of the exchange rate was enormous. When he got in office in January 2003, the exchange rate was 3.95 reais per dollar. But if you correct this for the last months that was in government in 2010, December 2010, when the exchange rate was left to Dilma in 1.65 reais per dollar, the one in the beginning was 6 reais per dollar. So he brought the exchange rate from 6 reais per dollar to 1.65. Well, this is a wonderful thing for a president. You increase wages, you control inflation, everybody's happy. The only problem is that President Dilma had no chance of doing. Now she gets an administration where he has to depreciate the currency. He was unable to do that. She has to reduce wages. He was not prepared for this. She was prepared for continuing her policy. Impossible. So the first fundamental reason why an exchange rate is essential, an exchange rate maintained in a competitive level for the country is essential because it gives access to demand to competent business enterprise. Second, because it creates financial instability and eventually crisis, financial crisis. Third, because it increases in the short term wages and consumption, making people help in the short term at the cost of growth and financial stability. Well, then comes the question, why economists don't work on that matter? Why the economists don't argue for a small current account surplus in countries like Argentina and Brazil that have the same type of Dutch disease, not a very severe Dutch disease, a moderate Dutch disease. Why? Well, an explanation is due to the sixfold ignorances that I just listed before. They don't know this and though, maybe, but because, and this is what I want to suggest to you, they don't act as a rein to the exchange rate populism of politicians, as it to be their role, but on the contrary. Our economists, when come to government, I have my experience, I know, and I know the others, they come to office and they become the champions of economic reasoning against the populism of their presidents or their first prime ministers. But where? This is always in the budget deficit. In the current account deficit, forget about. Like the Europeans forgot fully the current account deficits, the Spain, Portugal, Italy, etc. Here in developing countries, no worry about that. It makes no sense if you have to control both things. Well, so what you say, if the politician has not the reign of rationality of the economist, he'll be his job of following the populist cycle, but not only the populist cycle, a longer cycle that goes beyond the 4 years administration is very strong. I think that when this happens, when they don't serve as a rein to exchange rate populism of the politicians, they are revealing a preference for immediate consumption. Well, I thought twice if I should say that, because Keynesians are not supposed to fight against consumption. I am not fighting against consumption. First, the whole idea of development is to have higher wages and high consumption. This is obvious. But Keynes also told us how to have consumption and growth. Not exactly this. In shorthand, for sure, demand is created also by, but in the end, finally, why China grows freezing? Why China grows much faster than Brazil? Essentially because they invest and save 45% of GDP, we 20 or less. And what I see, and look, what I see of this behavior of economists is equal, independent of being left-wing or right-wing. Now, in the present situation, all the conservative economists in Brazil, they are supporting the exchange rate policy of the government. Don't change this. It's okay. That's nice for several reasons, including, they also say, including because this is necessary to protect the wages of the workers. I believe that growth depends essentially on a class coalition, a developmental class coalition. And the developmental class coalition is done when business industrialists and workers and the public bureaucracy get an agreement about. And in this agreement, the workers are supposed to have a relative reduction in their wages for some time. This is what we did for a long time in our history. This is what, for instance, the Germans did recently. But we're forgetting this. Thank you.
Before we go to the audience, I want to give the speakers a chance to respond to one another. Briefly.
Well, it is,
Please identify yourself.
yes, sure. Rogério Sobreira from Mainz. Well, it was a great presentation that I expected. I wouldn't expect less than all of you. And my question goes essentially to Nelson, but although it, well, overlaps a little bit with what was presented by Bresser. You said that one of the choices, so to speak, of the Brazilian government in order to boost economic growth was to rely strongly on incentives to investments. On this, what crossed my mind when you said that was, okay, but since the economy is not having a huge growth, since we have problems related to exchange rate appreciation and something. Well, how can we how those stimuli could well guarantee, so to speak, that the investment, the private investment, will follow? Actually, in other words, how can we convince the horse to drink water? Right.
Let's take a few for the different panelists. We'll go right here in front and then start to move back. Please keep the questions brief so we have some time.
Sure. Great presentations. I guess I have one question for Roberto and a short one for Nelson. I lived with you guys last winter, and I read all those papers, and I'm very convinced about the real exchange rate story. But if we think about it as a model for a macroeconomic development model for developing countries, it seems to me not everybody can do it, and certainly not everybody could do it at once, right? It seems like you have to have three different kinds of countries doing it. You either have to have lots of surplus labor in agriculture, or to be able to do it on low wages, or you need a massive innovation machine, or you need continually rising commodity prices, both to keep it competitive and to maintain the reserves. And so in addition to all that, you need real institutional capacity to be able to orchestrate all of that together. And so for the poorest countries, I wonder how that can happen. And obviously, if everybody does it at the same time, then you have competitive devaluations, and no one will be able to keep their own national level of equilibrium. So I'm just wondering if you've thought about it in its global context. I could see how for Argentina today or for Peru today it might be a great thing, but if the new BRICS Bank was going to sell that as the model and advise countries to do it, I wonder how we'd deal with the conflicts. And then quick, Nelson, in the last panel, I dodged a question because I'm not Brazilian, but I'm not sure my Brazilian colleagues totally answered it, was you showed your graph here about how the capital control and prudential regulation period was relatively successful, but there was a question in the last panel about how, given the fact that you have a non-deliverable forward market here and a lot of it is offshore, how did you try to, if it was successful, how did you try to capture that part of the market?
Let's take one more from Martin. Then we'll go to the panelists and take another round.
Thank you.
Hopefully.
I'm Martin Rapetti from CEDES and University of Buenos Aires. Two quick questions for you, Nelson. The first one, I'm not sure what to make about the concave relationship between the real exchange rate and economic growth, in the sense that I myself have done some economic work, and you kind of find this kind of relationship for panel data also. But my take on that is that you probably have in the data set experiences of hyperinflation with low growth. And typically you have hyperinflation and high real exchange rate, which is the case actually of Brazil. So probably in your time series analysis of the Brazilian relationship between the real exchange rate and economic growth, this is also happening. So maybe what you get basically is a monotonous or sort of, for certain range, monotonous relationship between the level and economic growth. So a comment on that would be good. And the other thing is that I was thinking a lot on your last slide, where you summarized the three options to reduce the unit labor cost in dollars. And of course, the one you advocated for is like the less politically complex, because it's productivity gains. And I'm not so sure whether you can rely on that, especially when you have the unit labor cost too high, right? So so going to the second choice, which would be the value in using the exchange rate. Do you think, what do you think about the pass-through in Brazil today? Because I was shocked yesterday when I was walking.
Okay, I
looking
think
at
we got
some-
the question. Let's give him a chance to respond, and we'll do another round.
Ball in the-
First question, how private investment will follow. Well, I actually, as an economist, I will agree with Ster and Bresser about investment. I think there's a huge part of the investment that is exogenous. It's done by the government itself or by government companies. They say housing investment, infrastructure investment is done heavily by the government, so it's autonomous. So actually the government can actually lead the way. And if you analyze the Brazilian economy, usually during the cycles, either the government or multinational firms usually invest ahead, and the private sector is induced by that. So I think both views can be right. And how you bring the horse to water is actually if you go before there and drink the water, and then you'll see that it can drink the water. About the NDF and offshore, yes, most of our exchange rates determined on the derivatives market. There's a huge offshore market for the Brazilian real, but the liquidity, most of the liquidity is here. So the offshore market cannot detach very much from the domestic market. That's why, even though we can fight, when we put the derivatives, the tax on the derivatives, everybody said, oh, that's not going to work, but everybody will do the NDFs there. But you have to have a lag here, because you have to close the operation somehow, and at the end of the day, you have to do it in domestic market. So even though it creates an imperfection, but it doesn't block the effectiveness of the controls on derivatives. On the real exchange rate and growth, I did that before the stabilization plan, so there's no hyperinflation there. The result is from 1996 to 2013. So there's two ways that you can interpret that. First, as I say, is a stylized fact. Whenever the exchange rate is too high or too low, the government steps in and slows growth. It's a policy-induced effect. Because at a high real exchange rate, you have inflation. At a low real exchange rate, you have current account problems. The other thing is that more economics, forget about the government. When you're appreciating from a very high real exchange rate, your tradable sector can sustain reduction in its margin, its operating margin, and still be competitive. But it reaches a point where they cannot compress their profit rates any longer, and so they get out of the market. That's why you have that non-linearity. I think it's both things. The valuation pass-through, I think most of the adjustment in Brazil happens through the exchange rate. But the question is whether the government should actively pursue that. I think what the government tries to do is actually not to let the exchange rate either to appreciate too much or to depreciate too much, which is another thing than to push it high to produce the adjustment. And the pass-through actually in Brazil today is small if you count out fuel prices. If you don't include fuel prices, the pass-through in Brazil is 5%. So if you have a 10% change, it's 0.5% of inflation. So it doesn't actually mess up the economy too much, but it has a social cost in the short run. So that's why I don't think you have to choose between the options. You have to make your reforms, try to increase growth and productivity, which has a long run impact, and you let the exchange rate fluctuate. And in that process, you don't rely too much on appreciation. There's an easy way to disinflate by through exchange rate appreciation, but that is only a short-run strategy. It doesn't work in the long run. So it's a more, how can I say? I don't know how to translate, sutil, nuanced. Yeah. nuances, a more nuanced thing, where you don't have a target for the exchange rate, but you don't try to rely on that too much to control your inflation. Which doesn't mean that you have to push it up to do the adjustment. The market will eventually do the adjustment, and what you have to do is actually to prepare yourself for if and when that adjustment happens. And that's where the international reserves comes and reduce the financial fragility of the economy.
Should I answer? Thank you. First, comment on the whole issue. If you don't want to devalue, don't let the exchange rate to appreciate too much. That's the point. Yeah, sure, the point. This is the main counsel you can give to a president. Yeah, but they don't believe on us. They don't believe. When they find a problem of an accelerated inflation, they, in the end, all governments rest on the appreciation of the exchange rate to reduce it. Mervyn King once was criticized, president of the Bank of England, for the appreciation of the British pound. He said, well, I'm in an inflation targeting regime. Why are you asking me to resign half of the effect of my interest rate policy, which is the appreciation of the British pound? So, an appreciation is very popular. I came to, and presidents don't want to depreciate because it's bad news always. And the other way that put Nelson as an alternative to depreciate the exchange rate, there are no historical cases of successful development process that haven't been led by depreciated exchange rate. Look at the difference. What's the main difference between the East Asian countries after the East Asian crisis? The difference became very clear after the East Asian crisis between them and us. It's Confucianism. They have confusion. No, because some people say that they all have the same tradition, cultural and religious tradition, or it's exchange rate policy. Look at the exchange rate policy, and you will find the main explanation of the difference between them and us. Then now let me go to the point that raised by Kevin. Yeah, we tackled this point with Rapetti in a paper we published years ago about, because I would say first, let people understand what I'm saying first, because there are a lot of technical problems and political problems in the implementation of a real exchange rate, depreciated real exchange rate trend. There are a lot of problems. In countries like ours, inflation is a serious threat. And the policy to control inflation in this context is very difficult because you can rest completely on monetary policy because there are limits on that, on the possibility, and fiscal policy, fiscal policy linked against the wind is very difficult because, Chileans had this experience and they wrote on that, some Chilean economists. They say have to cut social expenditures because people are importing too many Mercedes-Benz. Because it's accelerating private sector, middle and high middle class and high class middle. Your expenditures are more concentrated in poor people. So it's a very, very difficult from politics. But it can be managed. It can be managed smartly, but needs a very sophisticated government and a high level of coordination at the level of the presidency. So you need a president with a strategic view. If not, you cannot do it. Well, but the problem of say, not the coordination, simultaneously do it all. Okay. Well, in my view, external American, what people call international imbalances are sustainable in the long run, because what people of MMT say, because they print the money to finance their own current account deficit, and people want American money. So we have a kind of agreement with some people call the Bretton Woods, second Bretton Woods. Well, but why can other countries follow the Chinese and now stationed more generally way. Why can't? We're not so big economies. Argentina, even Brazil is not that big. External trade of Brazil is 10% of GDP. Yeah, we're saying, don't let the exchange rate represent. This won't transform Brazil in a huge exporter, displacing Germany exports in the world. It won't happen. But let's protect the domestic industrial sector, and let's protect the access, as say, of the domestic industry, manufacturing industry, to this growing demand. The graph that was presented in industrial in the morning, was presented. Industrial production and retail sales is very impressive. Which is the gap was filled by the imports. It's no secret on that. No, so I don't think there is a serious problem here, because, well, it's not very probable that all countries do the same at the same time for the beginning. But even though, what kind, our surpluses are really not that significant in comparison of the American current account deficit. We did finance very easily in this international context. No? Thank you.
I think that Roberto already answered Kevin, but I would like to add a few things. First, I'm not defending competitive depreciations. What I'm defending is that developing countries have an exchange rate level around which the exchange rate floats, that is competitive. That is according to the more fundamental principle of economics, which is that efficient business enterprises be competitive. This is the fundamental condition, and the exchange rate is supposed to guarantee this. Well, but if the country has a Dutch disease, that is Ricardian rents that appreciate permanently it has to neutralize this Dutch disease by imposing a tax on exports. When it does this, and it changes from the current to the industrial equilibrium, the equilibrium that makes, what happens? It will have a current account surplus. Well, but this is very bad. No? This is not reasonable. No? So these countries are going to have a current account surplus, and the rich countries, United States, Europe, Japan, and sometime later, and soon China, will have a current account deficit. Yes. Yes. Because look, what is happening today is just the opposite. What is considered normal, reasonable, acceptable is that developing countries have a current account deficit. So they can be financed by multinational corporations and banks and turning not competitive. And this kind of reasoning is very much ingrained in all economists. You are probably a little surprised about this, what I'm saying. But I think that you have to do, and it's difficult to change, because also Roberto said one thing very important.
Not only one.
Many, many. He said, what the politicians should know is that not to appreciate, to have them to depreciate. Okay, that's absolutely correct. But all the problem is that a country like Brazil, for instance, or a country like Argentina, because they got in trouble now, because they appreciated the currency and getting current account deficit and appreciate the currency. They have to make a change. And then but this is once and for all transition. After that, with an efficient, competent policy, they would, not populist policy, they would keep this now. But United States, Japan, China, and Europe can have current account deficits. Why not? they have reserve monies. If they have reserve money, they can print money and pay for this. That's okay. So, the new thinking.
Yeah, and then we'll go back to the floor.
One point only. In the aggregate, after the global crisis, as we call it, the developing countries continue to, in the aggregate, to generate surplus, more than $400 billion, and this continues. But it makes the diagnosis worse.
China and Asia.
Not only China.
In
Asia. So it makes more dramatic our account deficit because the flow continues going. The savings flow will continue going from developing countries to developed countries as it happened as from the early 2000s, but not for us. We in Latin America became out of this trend. You know?
So we'll go back to the floor, but I also want to ask all of you to help Roberto come up with a different acronym besides the SCR that was
Square was written by Lance. It's not my responsibility. We wrote a paper together, and Lance Taylor put it square.
So Lance needs some assistance, but please, yeah.
Maybe it could put the S's on the end. It becomes curses. I have quick questions for each of you. For Nelson, I was curious about your sideways S curve that then turned up, and I wondered why a level of the currency would cause inflation to be sustained. In other words, why couldn't it be, as Bresser-Pereira has just said, a once and for all correction that then works itself through? Is there, it's as if there's no patience on the part of the inflation targeting. So that was my question. For Roberto, just first, China is Confucian, and it did not devalue in the Asian financial crisis. Yeah. So they broke ranks a bit. And what their surpluses come from contractual surpluses, because they have a deficit on their normal trade. They have a surplus on the assembly trade, which by contract has to have a value added over what the imports are from the exports. So it didn't have anything to do with the exchange rate. It really happens to be with the volume of the assembly trade they have, which by contract, by legal agreement, has to have a surplus. So it's a different kind of a surplus than one generated by competitive devaluation. But I wondered, you had a phrase that was something, it was the inexistence of fiscal dominance. And maybe everybody understands what that means, and so I could ask you privately, but I would wonder if you could just explain what that means and fit it into the context of what you're saying. And then Bresser-Pereira, I remember 2 years ago you had a title on your presentation, "No Foreign Money, Thank You." But it seems to me that, and you may have answered it briefly, that this is really very much an export-oriented stimulus model, and that may be good for smaller economies, but for Brazil, is this really where the long-term stimulus for the private sector investment, where the catalyst needs to come? Whereas I think you or Nelson mentioned that the domestic public investment, if it's timed well and counter-cyclical, can play that role even better. So I just wondered how you could balance the two out. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take those in order.
Okay. Well, quickly, why the level of the real exchange rate may affect inflation. It functions as a protection or access, as Bresser said. The higher the real exchange rate, the more protected your economy is from foreign competition. So in some way that can increase the capacity of firms to pass through changes in their costs to prices. So that increase the pass-through effect, which determines the long-run rate in which inflation stabilizes. That's a theoretical explanation, but that curve is actually an empirical issue. When you run the regression from 1996 till now, you get that form of relationship in Brazilian inflation. Maybe it will die out in the future, but one possible explanation is this: the degree of protection for domestic firms. The higher the exchange rate, the higher their capacity to pass changes in their costs to final prices.
So it wasn't impatience with the working of the inflation targeting. In other words, no.
Thank you. Louder, energy. No, no, fiscal dominance. Well, in our countries, because we don't issue international currency, we have this, what some people call original sin. So it's not a sin, no? It's a truth of reality. But in our country, we have crowding out effects. So when there is a fiscal deficit, an important fiscal deficit or a significant, or both a significant public debt, if the government intends to finance this deficit by issuing bonds in the domestic market, it has to raise the interest rate to levels that are incompatible with investment or etc., and become attractor from capital from outside. Worse if they try to finance outside, as it happened in Argentina and sometimes here also. You know? So they rest on, governments tend to rest on the financing of central banks. And when an important part of the monetary operation of central bank are directed to finance a government, they have, you lost autonomy in the management of the monetary policy. It's very simple. It's a very orthodox, orthodox fiscal dominance comes from central banks literature. So it means that you are forced to finance fiscal deficit and the refinancing of fiscal debt in a context which is completely different from the United States. No? Because we don't have really sovereign money. You know?
Well, spot-led strategy. So there is a classical distinction between spot-led and wage-led strategy. And this was a paper by Baduri and Margling, 1991. And this paper was a bad thing. It's a nice paper, but it was a bad thing. Why? Right? Because the wage-led strategy that finally they preferred, right, was assuming import substitution. So assuming a closed economy and import substitution. This today makes no sense, finished. For middle-income countries and in our time. So, but then there is but you can think, instead of thinking in terms of wage-led and spot-led, you can think in terms of spot-led and the domestic consumption-led, okay? Well, how to define this? In this case, the definition, in my view, would be the import coefficient. If the import coefficient is increasing, is falling, you have a domestic led growth. If the importance or the openness coefficient is increasing, you have a spot-led strategy. And if it's reasonably stable, you have a balanced growth. Okay? So 3 alternatives, not 2. Well, for instance, what should happen to Brazil and Argentina? Right? I am against a spot-led, and I am against a domestic-led. I think that what we have to have is a balance. But to have a balance, we have first to change from this level that is absolutely inconsistent with growth to a different level, once and for all, as you well said. After this, balanced growth. Okay.
On that note, please join me in thanking the speakers.